Okay, so I would like to officially thank everyone for joining us today and welcome you all to our American Sephardi Federation Institute of Jewish Experience program today with Richard Sassoon, who has graciously offered to give us a little look into a little known, or at least little to us known, part of Iranian history, and obviously from a Jewish viewpoint as well. And so I hope that everybody is interested. Is entertained and is educated by what we're going to be talking about. I'm sure we will.
Interested doesn't hurt.
No, I won't. And just so you notice, your microphones and cameras are off as per our normal way of doing things. We will keep them off until after the presentation. At the end of the presentation, you will be invited to rejoin as a presenter. We do encourage you to. That doesn't mean you're going to be giving the rest of the lecture. That just means that we'd like to see faces. We'd like to see who's here. So please do. I will say, at this point, you can open your cameras, and then that's when the questions will really get into things. But in the meantime, please do throw into either the chat or the Q&A questions that you have. In the chat, please put in any technical issues you may have. I'll do what I can, but put into the Q&A, and Richard will be monitoring it throughout. So hopefully if there's something that's, but I didn't hear what you just said, or can you expand on that a little bit? He can work with that in if it works within the conversation. So please do think of this as an interactive presentation, although your microphones and cameras are off. And the person that you came to see is actually Richard Sassoon, who is of Iraqi-American heritage, Jewish heritage as well. He has a JD and an LL.M. in European business law from Madrid's Universidad Pontificia Comillas. He is also very near and dear to the heart of the American Sephardi Federation, as he is on the ASF Young Leaders Board, as well as one of the recipients of Broome Fellowship and Scholarship. And he has a long-standing interest in diverse cultures and regions, having visited over 50 different countries, which I am very jealous of. I don't think I'm even close, but I'm going to work on it after this whole COVID thing.
Europe tends to build up your numbers.
Huh?
Europe tends to build up your numbers.
Yeah, I know. You just got to go across there. I hear that.
Yeah.
And he met with various high-level diplomats with Jewish organizations working on 3 continents and handling legal documents in 5 languages, which also I'm jealous of, but that I'm working on. So without further ado, without hearing me more, please keep throwing things into the chat and Q&A, and I will go to mute. Thank you, Richard, very much for joining us.
Thank you, Jorah, for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak to the American Sephardi Federation. I've given a presentation once here before on modern Islamism, which is Islamic theocracy, but this is a completely different vein. And hopefully this can eventually become a series on, quote, Jews who matter, because we have this sort of overriding suspicion or belief that the history of the Jewish people until the formation of the state of Israel was always a reactive one, right? Jews were constantly being attacked, harassed, pogromed, and then they move into another city where they have some kind of beneficial treatment, and then that goes sour and attacked, pogromed, and then they're on to the next place. And so I wanted to capture some of the stories of Jews who actually contributed, and in the Sephardi world, we actually see this much more than we do in the Ashkenaz world. So this was a particularly interesting story to me, and I hope that you guys enjoy it. It's the story of ad-Dawla. And before we get into a lot of depth on who he is, let's first set out sort of the rules of this engagement, right? I'm not an academic, despite all those accolades and titles you just heard. None of them are in history, religion, psychology. All of this is done as a layperson who's very interested in the material, and I try to give it from sort of a secular perspective. Obviously, I'm going to discuss the Jewish elements and how they apply, but I'm trying to give this from more of a historical perspective than some sort of religious commentary. And this is, of course, like most topics, a sensitive topic when you get into history and details, and so let's be respectful of the material. That said, I do treasure interactivity, so please put comments, questions in the chat. If they fall into the presentation, I'm more than happy to address them at that time. If you want to keep those questions towards the end, put it in the Q&A slot, and then at the end, as Drora said, you'll be able to present your question and I can respond to it that way. I like to say that these presentations are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up as best I can. And if you do know something, hopefully I tell you something that's even more in depth, even more at a higher level than you were previously knowledgeable about. And this will be a recording. Drora is going to upload this onto the ASF's YouTube page, and you will be able to watch later. Or if you weren't able to come today, you can catch up on this. And if it becomes a series, of course, you can always look back. All right. So in order to sort of set the historical frame, I need to sort of explain what was going on in the world. And everybody knows that you had this massive Mongol empire created by Genghis Khan. But he wasn't the only Mongol, right? The empire continued after he died in 1227. And so we go through several great Khans until we get to the fourth great Khan, which is Menke. And Menke takes power in the year 1250. And you can see on this map the kind of vast territory that Menke controlled, all the way from the Pacific Ocean in that far eastern region of Russia, the northern part of Korea, all the way to Galicia in southern Poland, right? We know from the Ashkenaz community, the large community in Krakow, all those areas are under Mongol control as well. So you can imagine just the breadth of this empire. And if you focus to the southwest, you see that Persia, the Caucasus region, and parts of modern Turkey are also part of this Mongol empire. And this is the largest extent that this empire gets as a unified entity. Now, at this point, you have what's called a kurultai, which is a meeting of all the Mongol lords in order to appoint Menke to the leadership post of this entire Mongol empire. And at this point, you have a number of Muslim leaders from Persia, led by this man, Mustafa Khazvini. You can see a bust of him in the lower right-hand side, who go to Menke and petition him, saying that Persia has been conquered by the Mongols, but there's a lot of disarray and lack of organization because Persia had been under the control of a number of different Turkic tribes that had not unified the country. And so what really needed to happen was to create a strong, powerful, unified state. And now that the Mongols were in control of most of Persian territory, the Menke should send somebody who would become a king of Persia. And so that's exactly what he does. Menke sends his brother Hulagu to the west, and he enters Persia and he takes direct control of it. He manages to put down a number of rebel groups, such as the Lurs in the Zagros Mountains, such as the Assassins. We're going to talk a little bit about them in the area near Gilan, in the mountains surrounding Alamut. And you can see in the center left, this is a picture of Hulagu Khan taking Alamut fortress, defeating those assassins. He then moves west into Baghdad. And as we famously know, he besieges the city and he burns the city to the ground, killing all of the inhabitants of the city, with the exception of the Nestorian Christians, probably because his wife was Nestorian Christian. But, and this, of course, is one of the darkest days in the history of the Islamic world, because this was the burning of the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, to which Jews disproportionately contributed. Hulagu also conquered a number of other territories, but at the end of the day, he tried to organize the new territory that he had conquered and unified as a singular state. And to that end, he began to create governors for the various regions he conquered. The first governor of Iraq was actually this man Guo Khan. You can see him in the upper left-hand side. Guo was a Chinese national, conscripted into the Mongol service because he was good with artillery. And so we begin, but Guo Khan only rules Baghdad for 1 year before he's replaced by Atamalik Juvayni, who is a Persian. And so we begin to see this friction that begins to develop between the Persian bureaucrats, who are now responsive to this new Mongol empire, and the people that the Mongols bring with them, either Mongol princes, Chinese conscripts, people from further east than the easternmost borders of Iran. And we're going to see more of this dual power structure as we move forward. Now, Hulagu Khan is not able to take the Levant region, right, the region that has Israel in it, because the Mamluks based in Egypt defeat him at the Battle of Ain Jalut. You can see sort of You can see Baibars in the center in that black sort of pedestal, and you can see the original march by Hülgü Khan to try and take Israel, but that fails. So by 1262, Mönke has now been in power for about 10 years or so, but in the year 1260, he dies. And when he dies, there's a huge succession crisis in the Mongol Empire. And so it splits, and you can see the Golden Horde, the White Horde, the Ilkhan, the Chagatai, and the Mongol dynasty in China. Those five become separate khanates of their own under their own government. So Hülgü is now upgraded from being just a subordinate Khan to the Great Khan to being his own quasi-independent leader. And he begins to have a number of fractious relationships with the Golden Horde and with the Chagatai, which are on his border, as well as with the Mamluks. So he's got three borders of his with numerous enemies. And so he had to begin to consolidate authority. And so the Mongols switch from being this conquering mass that just keeps expanding, especially when we talk about the Middle East, this conquering mass that keeps expanding, to one that is much more concerned with creating allies, fomenting alliances, and hardening the bureaucracy. So just sort of pointed out, this is the Genghis Khan's family, and you can see the green squares that represent the four of the five major khanates, with Hülgü being represented by the Ilkhanate. So this becomes the territory of Hülgü's kingdom, right? It extends from central Turkey through what's modern day Iraq. You can see they control parts of the Caucasus, and they control all of modern day Iran, some of modern day Afghanistan, some of modern day Turkmenistan, some of modern day Pakistan. So we begin to see this conflict when it gets to the time of Hülgü's grandchildren. And this conflict is between rulers who are aligning either more with the Muslim invaders, with the Mongol invaders, or with the Muslim Persian bureaucrats. And so we mentioned Atamelik Juvayni. You can see a bust of him on the right-hand side. He served under Hülgü and his son Abhar, and he wrote the famous history, Tarikh Jahangushai, the history of the world conqueror, which of course details the conquests of Genghis Khan, as well as a number of the battles of Hülgü Khan. And he was responsible for creating a modern bureaucracy within Persia in service to Abhar Khan. His brother Shamsuddin met with one of the Mongol princes. Now, under the rules of the Ilkhanate, only a Mongol prince could inherit power, but the question was, how are they going to administer that power? And in many cases, the Mongol princes were less familiar with the specific minutiae of the markets, of trade, of the pathways that a person would go through to get to the market, about what the different industries were in different regions. So they needed to ally with local individuals who were well educated and could explain these kinds of things. So Teguder converted to Islam, which is why he's called Ahmed Teguder. Ahmed was his Muslim name. And he met with Shamsuddin, the brother of Atamelik. So he created the first Muslim rulership of the Ilkhanate, right? Because the Mongols before this point, some were Buddhist, some were Tengrist. They were the religions of the Eastern steppes. And there was, but a number of the Mongol princes, the majority of the Mongol princes, were not happy that Ahmed Teguder had converted to Islam, that he was beginning to rule as a Muslim ruler, because the majority of these princes were still Buddhist or Tengrist. And one of these was Arğun. So even Ahmed Teguder's mother helped Arğun in 1284 launch a coup to take power from Ahmed Teguder. At the same time, Arğun begins reaching out to the east, reaching out to Kublai Khan, who is his great uncle ruling China. And Kublai Khan responds by sending a diplomatic attaché to him, which includes Chongxiang, meaning chancellor, Amir Bulqa. And Bulqa was another prince from the central Mongolian regions. Since Bulqa was able to help Arğun take power and remove the influence of Ahmet Teguder, Amir Bulqa became the chief governor of Mesopotamia. And his brother, Amir, also became another governor. So the timeline that we're focusing on is this timeline of Arğun. And you can see him in the center in that sort of green robe. This is a painting from one of, I believe, Rashid ad-Din Hamadani's Majma' al-Tarikh, the Compendium of History. One thing to notice is, of course, this is my first picture of Sa'ad ad-Dawla. Unfortunately, in most Muslim societies, we don't see drawings and pictures because of prohibitions on creating images. So we have no extant image of Sa'ad ad-Dawla. Whenever I point to an image of Sa'ad ad-Dawla that I'm designating it as such in this presentation, that's just a minister that we haven't determined who it is, or it's an actor playing somebody in a film, in order to give the idea of the appearance, the position, the way that these people would have behaved, even if it's not an actual image of the person. So I wanted to deconstruct a little bit about Sa'ad ad-Dawla's life before we go in depth about who he was and how he lived. So not all of the sources agree on what his name is, but the scholarly consensus tends to be that his name was Sa'ad ad-Dawla bin Hibbatullah bin Muhasib Abhari. And so let's take that apart. His given name Sa'ad ad-Dawla is not his real birth name. We don't know what his real birth name is, but it was very common for Jews who were affluent within the Persian Empire at this time to take Arabic names that would indicate that they had some kind of stature in the government or in politics, so or in medicine or in economics. Wherever they had stature, they would take these kinds of names. So Sa'ad ad-Dawla literally means felicity of the nation, happiness of the nation. His father, Hibbatullah is not a common Arabic name, and it literally means God gifted or gift of God, which is probably the Arabic equivalent of Yonatan or Netanel, right? These two names in Hebrew meaning gift of God. His grandfather's name, Muhasib, was likely a reference to his profession, right? Muhasib is an accountant. So we can see that this entire name is somehow constructed in Arabic, despite it referring to a person who is, he was Arabic speaking, he was probably Persian, he was Persian speaking dominantly, probably could read and write Arabic. We know for certain that he could read Turkish and Mongolic, because that's how he began to create relations with the Mongols. But his name in Arabic was a construction to reflect that he was part of this educated society, and that was the mark that you would have then, the same way that most Jews today in the United States have English constructed names in addition to their Hebrew or personal names. But the key part that I want to focus on here is this surname that he has, which is Abhari, right? A person from Abhar. Now Abhar, you can see, is just beyond the mountains, close to the Caspian Sea, near the city of Qom and Qazvin, in the northwestern part of modern Iran. There was a Jewish community that lived in Abhar. We don't know the exact size of it, but it was not a major community in comparison to, for example, the Baghdad Jewish community or the communities further east like Mashhad or Isfahan. Isfahan a little bit more south than east. And from his time in Abhar, he moved at a relatively early age, we don't know when, to the city of Mosul, which is in the northern part of Iraq. You can sort of follow on the map on the left-hand side. From Mosul, he moves to Baghdad, where he becomes very well acquainted with the finances of Baghdad. And when he finally enters the service of Arğun in 1289, he moves to Tabriz, which was the Ilkhanate capital. So you can see he sort of moves around in a very constrained area, despite the fact that this Mongol Ilkhanate is a large empire. So The first time that ad-Dawla shows up in the historical record is in 1284. And by 1284, he's already achieved a number of different expertises. The first thing is that he's very clearly skilled in Islamic medicine. And in Mosul, we have records of him working in the hospitals there. So we know that he was relatively well practiced, and he managed to keep himself up to date on the newest surgeries and techniques of the day. At the same time, he was relatively skilled in economics. He was what was called the Dalal, and a Dalal was an official that existed within the marketplace who negotiated the prices for large-scale consumers, similar to a broker-dealer or an auctioneer in modern parlance. And as a Dalal, he was very familiar with the economic situation going on in Mosul. He was also in charge of monitoring the Suq Sinah. The Suq Sinah is the craftsman marketplace. And so he would be in charge of making sure that the craftsmanship was done properly, that the people were properly compensated, that the craftsmen weren't being stolen from, all these kinds of things. And he helped monitor these kinds of practices. In this way, he became part of the Persian bureaucratic system. Now, it appears from this time period that there was a glass ceiling in terms of how far non-Persians, and by Persian we mean ethnic Muslim Persian speakers, could rise in the bureaucracy, but at that point, he's not hitting any of those glass ceilings. So by 1284, we see him because the Mongol governors decide that they want to elevate him. So you have a new protector of Baghdad, a Shihna-i Baghdad. And the Shihna at this time is a man named Tonska, and he shows up in 1284, and he promotes Sa'ad ad-Dawla to be part of the Divan-i Baghdad, the Baghdad Council. Now, the way that the governmental structure worked at that time was that you had what was called a divan, where a number of different representatives would sit in a collective circle and deliberate, very similar to a House of Representatives, if you can imagine it this way. But unlike the American legislative councils, the divan was not supposed to come to a fractious relationship, right, where you have parties and different groups, but rather they were supposed to rule by consensus. And so there would be lots of long-form debate. And Sa'ad ad-Dawla contributed to this, especially with his economic knowledge. When we talk about Mongol governors like Tonska, we're talking about people who were Mongols brought from the east. So you can sort of look at this picture. This is a painting by Sergei Ivanov. He's Russian, and so he's detailing the Mongol leadership in Russia, which were called Baskak, which is different than a little bit different than the Mongol governorship in Iraq, but it's not that different. So you can see how different the local people were from these Mongol princes who showed up. The Mongols would convene these divan, mostly made of Persians and local Arabs, as well as some Mongol princes, in order to come to these consensuses. As we mentioned, Arğun reached out to his compatriot, Kublai Khan, who was ruling the Chinese side of the Mongol Empire, and sent a delegation. This delegation arrived with several Mongol princes, one of whom is actually really important for our story, is Ordoqiya. You can see Ordoqiya on the left-hand side. He was a Mongol prince who instantly took a liking to Sa'ad ad-Dawla, and the two of them became very close friends. And in a certain way, they both saw themselves as fish out of water, right? Sa'ad ad-Dawla is one of the few Jews on this divan. And at the same time, Ordoqiya had no local allies. There were no princes that were directly related to him that were operating in the Ilkhanate. And at the same time, he wasn't indigenous to the region, so he didn't really know many people. So these two leaders became very, very well connected with each other, and they began to spend increasing amounts of time with each other. We also see that the Ilkhanate is going through a massive structural change that Arğun is having difficulty understanding from an economic perspective. And there's a few reasons that this economic transition is occurring. The first one is that the Mongol economy, when the Mongols were expanding very, very quickly, was based primarily on pillaging, right? You would raid a village, you would sack it, you'd bring the money from that, and with that money, you could pay the princes and the soldiers and everybody else. Now that you're having a settled economy, pillaging is no longer a viable way to create rents and bring money into the central coffers. So this Mongol pillaging stops, and we have a massive deficit in the government spending because they have to maintain all of these Mongol soldiers, troops, and princes. Another major issue is the Persian merchantry was very loath to pay taxes. I don't think that this is surprising to anybody because pretty much nobody ever likes paying taxes. But now that they knew that they had Mongol overlords who didn't understand the specificity and organization of these merchant groups, they paid even fewer taxes than before. Compounding this was the fact that a lot of the Mongol princes who had been put in charge of governing these kinds of territories were beginning to hoard more and more money for themselves because they were afraid that the central government couldn't pay the needs of them and their soldiers, as well as the fact that they felt the right to be enriched by their standing as governors and reward the people they wanted to impress. And finally, the extent of the trade routes and connections that the Persians had, especially to India, was something that the Ilkhans really didn't understand. And so we begin to sort of see the Persian bureaucrats in this way, as well as the Mongol princes, not working effectively to bring money into the central coffers, especially in the four regions that I've outlined here, right? Iraqi-Arab, the Arab part of Iraq, Iraqi-Ajam, the Persian part of Iraq, as it was called. Now, Iraqi-Ajam today is modern Iran. The region of Azerbaijan, both Iranian Azerbaijan and the Caucasus region, and Khorasan, which is northeastern Iran into what's now Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. So in these four regions, we have massive economic shortfalls. So in order to deal with this situation, we begin to see Arğun looking for a third pillar, right? We have the Persian bureaucrats, we've got the Mongol princes, and he is beginning to distrust both of these groups. So he's looking for some third way to deal with the problem. Now, at the same time, in the Divan, Sa'd ad-Dawla had attracted a number of enemies. And so these enemies petitioned to Arğun to talk to this Sa'd ad-Dawla because he's a doctor and Arğun needed medical assistance at the time. They figured that if he went to Tabriz, right, to meet with Arğun, he would be outside of Baghdad and therefore would leave them alone. And so Arğun and Sa'd ad-Dawla got to talking. Sa'd ad-Dawla helped cure Arğun of a small disease that he had. And the two of them began talking. As I said, Sa'd ad-Dawla was fluent in the Mongolian language. And so he and Arğun had numerous conversations. And it began that it wasn't just medical advice that he was taking from Arğun. He began to take financial advice. He began to take administrative advice. And so over the course of the year 1289, the two of them became increasingly close. And this also brought Ordoqiya into the audience of Arğun in a more notable way than before. So these three individuals now, Arğun, the Ilkhan, was beginning to see Sa'd ad-Dawla and Ordoqiya as being his primary ways of counterbalancing the majority of the other Mongol princes and the Persian bureaucrats. And we have a situation in Iraq that requires intimate knowledge of the Iraqi financial system, a financial system that, of course, for the last 2 or 3 years, Sa'd ad-Dawla has been part of, right? He was part of the Divani Baghdad, that Baghdad Council. And so he was intimately familiar with the financial situation going on in Baghdad, where you had higher taxes than should have been necessary to funnel money into the coffers of Amir Bolqa. You had a large-scale amount of infertile land in Iraq. We mentioned in the 1260s that Hulagu Khan had conquered 1250s and 1260s that Hulagu Khan had conquered Persia and Iraq, and in so doing, he destroyed what were called the Qanat, or these underground water tributaries that sent water from the canals all the way to the areas that would be cultivated. Because in an arid or semi-arid climate, such as prevails in Iraq and Iran, you need these kinds of irrigation systems to create large amounts of food. So now these farms were inoperable and inoperative. So the peasants couldn't generate wealth from the ground in order to pay the taxes that they had been burdened with. You also had Amir Boka and his brother Aruk having difficulty collecting the taxes that they did impose. And so they would come up to merchants in the bazaar and threaten them in order to take away their wealth. So Sa'd ad-Dawla understood this situation, and he explained it to Arğun in its strong complexity. Of course, not laying the blame at Hulagu Khan, but at these other Mongol representatives and Persian bureaucrats for being unable to master the situation. And so, of course, whenever you give a detailed analysis of the situation at hand, the natural response is, well, okay, then you do it. So Sa'd ad-Dawla was appointed as Mushraf, a regional investigator, to look at this situation, to determine where the money was being embezzled, how the taxes could be streamlined, how money could enter the coffers of the Ilkhanate court. And he does this very effectively. He manages to double the revenues that the Ilkhanate was bringing in. And of course, Arğun is very happy to have significantly more money at his disposal. That said, it made him a larger number of enemies than he already had, because the way that he found this money was to strip a lot of the Mongol princes of the wealth that they had unfairly accrued, and shift more and more authority to Arğun as the central leader. So we have, for example, the Sahib-i-Divan, the head of the Divan. His name was Kutlugh Shah, and one of Sa'd ad-Dawla's first acts was to remove Kutlugh Shah from power and to seize a lot of his ill-gotten wealth. Now, Kutlugh Shah was one of the people that Boka had put in power. And so as Kutlugh Shah was removed and one or two other of Amir Boka's subordinates were removed by Sa'd ad-Dawla, he became increasingly afraid that he would lose his power, even though Sa'd ad-Dawla couldn't come after him directly at this point. Understanding this, he began to align himself with a new Mongol prince, Jishkeb, and he began to gather all of his allies to rally behind Jishkeb in an attempt to overthrow Arğun. When Arğun became aware of this attempted treachery, he brought Boka before him and decapitated him. You can see the execution of Boka on the right-hand side. Another source that Sa'd ad-Dawla discovered was that the region of Salghur, which you can see here in southern Iran, that region had not been paying taxes for about 10 years. The Persian bureaucrats had been covering it up. And so when he was actually able to properly collect taxes from this region, of course, treasury revenues increased dramatically. So during this time as the Mushraf, as we said, he paid back large amounts of revenue that had been taken by force. He collected outstanding taxes. He regulated the budget, and he doubled the tax revenue. And Arğun was not only was the treasury expanded. Arğun's personal coffers were expanded, and of course, bringing money to the great Ilkhan was going to result in personal favor. So at the end of the year, Sa'd ad-Dawla is promoted to the title of Grand Vizier, which makes him the most powerful person in the Ilkhanate, short of Arğun himself. And we know several things about what he did while he was Grand Vizier in these 2 years, from 1289 until 1291. The first thing is that he developed a legal code in order to regulate and standardize the economic system, the legal system, the criminal system, many other aspects of Ilkhanate law. Now, the way he was able to do this was because he actually understood Islamic law, right? He has to deal with a Persian bureaucracy. He's been working with them for a long period of time. So not only is he educated in his Jewish understandings, he actually understands what Islamic law is and is able to tie all of his regulations to Islamic law in a way that it becomes unimpeachable from a jurisprudential aspect. He is responsible for removing a number of the extremely cruel and oppressive punishments. He cuts down the number of robberies because the taxes he's aligned are more natural and prevent widespread strife, but he also simply secures more of the country. He's also responsible for promoting literature development, especially in Baghdad, funding many writers, poets in this period. Unsurprisingly, many of these poets speak very highly of these legal reforms that Sa'd ad-Dawla made. He also, as is natural, regulated the financial system and created a uniform financial system across the Ilkhanate. Remember, when Mustafa Qazvini went to the Kurultai in 1250, right, the problem was that Iran had been under numerous different Turkic leaders with different legal programs. Sa'd ad-Dawla harmonized and unified the financial structure of the Ilkhanate. Now, we have a number of, we're going to talk a little bit about the chroniclers and their opinion of Sa'd ad-Dawla, but suffice it to say, Wasaf is not terribly enamored with Sa'd ad-Dawla. As I said, we're going to explain why later, but you can imagine that how difficult it is to write. Through pain teeth, he says, I had to mention how good Sa'd ad-Dawla's laws were because everybody talks about it. So when Sa'd ad-Dawla became the Grand Vizier of the Persian Empire, he began this process of replacing all of the Mongol princes in areas where he could do so and replace them with members of his own family or members from the Jewish community. So we see his two brothers, Fakhr ad-Dawla and Amin ad-Dawla, being put in charge of important areas. Fakhr ad-Dawla is given control of Baghdad. Amin, if you remember, that had previously been under Amir Boqa, but of course Amir Boqa had been assassinated for his part in the conspiracy to overthrow Arğun. So Fakhr ad-Dawla now had that position. He put his other brother Amin ad-Dawla as the ruler of Mosul, Diyarbakir, and Mardin. These are areas in the north of Iraq and the south of modern-day Turkey. He puts a cousin of his, Muhazzab ad-Dawla, as another administrator in Baghdad, subordinate to his brother. He puts another Jew from the community, Labid bin Abi Rabi', into Azerbaijan, which is the region of northern Iran and the modern-day Republic of Azerbaijan, both of these, to become an administrator. And similarly to Sa'd ad-Dawla, many of these people had multiple areas of expertise. Muhazzab ad-Dawla Abu Mansur, who was Labid's assistant, was also his doctor. And so you had a lot of these Jews being relatively well educated and wealthy. And the Ilkhanid court became increasingly full with more and more Jews representing this third power structure. Many of the Persian bureaucrats and the Mongol princes became increasingly irate at the fact that they were being shut out of the power structure by ad-Dawla's very effective means of nepotism and promotion. We have very little in terms of what the Jewish community itself wrote about ad-Dawla. The only real source that continues to us is Bar Hebreus, who was a Jew who lived in the Ilkhanate. And he writes that a common phrase uttered during this period was, through ad-Dawla, the Lord hath raised on high the horn of redemption and hope of glory for the sons of the Hebrews in their last days, right? This is incredible praise, right? This is the idea that ad-Dawla is bringing power to the Jewish community, is bringing respect to the Jewish community, and that the Jews of Persia were being well received. Understandably, the fact that they were economically ascendant and politically ascendant during this time were positive. We don't know to what extent the ad-Dawla was involved in Jewish ritual practice, but we do know that he was involved in promoting the welfare of the Jewish community and founded a number of institutes during his reign. You can see this, these are pictures from later periods of Persian Jewry, right? Of course, photography didn't exist at this point, but should give you an idea of what the Persian Jews looked like. So now, while the Jewish view of ad-Dawla was generally positive, the Muslim view, especially those that we have written down, because remember, the people who are writing are the Persian bureaucrats that are being unseated by ad-Dawla and his increasingly large Jewish entourage in Arğun's political establishment. They have very negative things to say about him. The first one is that they were circulating Quranic verses, especially this Quranic verse 582, talking about how the Jews are the enemies of the Muslims. And you see this kind of anti-Semitism rising up at this time against the Jewish community, but especially against ad-Dawla. And so it's a huge question among historians as to whether this is playing on nascent anti-Semitic attitudes or whether they're using the Quran to justify their hatred of ad-Dawla. And since, of course, the Quran doesn't talk about any specific person living in the 13th century, they're going to his Jewish identity as a marker of why he is an undesirable person. We also have a number of discussions, especially by Wasaf, that the way that these Persian bureaucrats and Mongol princes were removed from power and Jews put in their place was through trickery and deceit, that ad-Dawla was lying, falsifying information, and making it look like these administrators were bad when in fact they were actually helpful and good. Another important aspect of this kind of anti-ad-Dawla thinking was conspiratorial thinking that we see from Wasaf and a number of other leaders like Aqsarai. Now, Aqsarai in particular would have had reason to hate ad-Dawla because ad-Dawla fired his boss, which meant that Aqsarai was out of a job for a while. And so we begin to see in Persia this theory that the Jews, especially led by ad-Dawla, were trying to delegitimize Islam. The way that they constructed this argument was in several different sections. The first one was that ad-Dawla was working with Arğun to create a prophetic lineage for Arğun himself and to post Arğun within a Mongol world of prophecy and therefore give him legitimation through that. This was necessarily contrary to Islamic tenets, right? That Muhammad is the capstone of the prophets. And so the idea that Arğun could be a prophet, could have some kind of prophecy, was unacceptable in Muslim eyes. They also, Wasaf also notes that Sa'd ad-Dawla is creating up stories, ancestral stories, and abusing historical legends in order to help buttress this new claim that Sa'd ad-Dawla and Arğun are working on, by referring to fables of the ancestors, false stories that shouldn't be believed. And furthermore, he points to the construction of boats in Basra. This is especially discussed by Ibn Fuwayti, that there are these boats in Basra that are being constructed with the purpose being a water-bound invasion around the Arabian Peninsula in order to arrive at Mecca and Medina, destroy the Kaaba, and end Islam. Now we have other sources from this period that point out that the boats that are being built in Basra in southern Iraq are being built by the Genoese in order to circumvent Mamluk trade with India, but Wasaf doesn't take those. Either he's unaware of this knowledge, or decides to disregard it to build on his conspiratorial thinking about what Sa'd ad-Dawla is doing. Now I have a question here. What were the underlying reasons for their anti-Semitism? Was it rooted in jealousy, fears? Why were they hating and trying to spread hate of the Jews? I think I sort of covered a lot of those reasons. I think that to a certain degree, it has to do with the fact that you have this power structure that is being directly compromised, right? You have to remember who's doing the writing, right? A lot of these writers that we're going to see who comment on this period are people who either like Karim ad-Din Aksarai, people who lost their jobs because of the actions of Sa'd ad-Dawla, people like Wasaf, who considered Sa'd ad-Dawla to have improperly usurped power, because there are Quranic verses that Wasaf believes mean that no Muslim should serve under a Jewish government. And you have Ibn al-Fuwayti, who comes at this from the a theological perspective that there should be a curse upon the Jews, that Jews shouldn't have had this power. And so maybe that rests on older anti-Semitic motifs that are being built up in this period. So you have those sort of issues mounting at a confluence: enmity towards Sa'd ad-Dawla and his power structure in and of itself, and sort of background hatreds of Jews that were part of the Persian world, but became accentuated with this new target. Okay. We also see that there is agreement between Muslim groups as to the problem of the Jews. At this point, it's at this point, we have to point out that Persia was majority Sunni, right? We think of Persia today as a Shiite country, and today it is a Shiite country, but that change occurred in the 1500s and 1600s. So in this period, in 1290, Persia was majority Sunni. There was a Shiite group in the south of Persia, in the south of Iraq, but it was not very large. The largest Shiite community at this time was actually the Ismailis. And these Ismailis are operating had previously been operating out of a number of castles in northern Iran. You can see, if you look at the close inset map, where these castles were at the height of Ismaili power. Now, these Ismailis had a military force, but of course their militaries were nowhere near the size and scale of the larger empires that surrounded them. And so in order to take control, they resorted to assassination, which is where the term assassin comes from. Anyway, so these assassins, despite being defeated, still existed to a small degree. And so Amin, who was Sa'd ad-Dawla's brother, arrested 3 of these assassins, and they said, "We 3 men have come to kill you, and 3 other men have gone to Babylon to kill the Jew who is there," referring, of course, to his brother Fakhr ad-Dawla. Sorry. So we have alignment between the Sunnis and the Ismailis over the fact that the Jews need to go down, and not only the Jews and the Christians. One of the things that's worth pointing out is that Arğun actually sent an emissary, a Christian emissary, a Mongol Christian, to Western Europe in order to create an alliance between the Ilkhanate and the Western European states. And this sort of goes to the question I have in the comments of the Jewish star and the crucifix on top of each other, on top of the Muslim crescent. The assassins claimed that they were under Jewish and Christian domination and hegemony. The Christians through their alliances with Western Europe, the Jews through their direct control of the Vizierate. And so that was what brought the Sunni and Ismaili Muslims together to oppose Sa'd ad-Dawla. The end of Sa'd ad-Dawla comes at the feast of Taghat Shar. One of the Mongol princes invites Ordoqiya and Sa'd ad-Dawla to this feast, and they are all massacred, along with a number of other supporters. We end up having Arğun himself being sick during this period, which is why the feast was able to occur and all those assassinations occur. He was being cared for by a Buddhist Lama who gave him medication for 5 months, but in the 10th of March in 1291, he died. And as I said, on the 3rd of March, 1291, Sa'd ad-Dawla had died. Now, following Sa'd ad-Dawla's death, we have a large-scale pogrom against the Jewish community. Bar-Hebraeus speaks about it, saying, "When the report of the murder of Sa'd ad-Dawla was heard, the Arabs armed themselves and went to the Jewish quarter of Baghdad. Jews fought against the Arabs, killed and were killed, and no Jews were left alive to rule over them," meaning that the Jewish power structure was removed. We have in the Persian literature a discussion of the death of Fakhr ad-Dawla and Amin ad-Dawla. Muhazzab ad-Dawla himself was, both Fakhr ad-Dawla and Amin ad-Dawla were strangled. Muhazzab ad-Dawla was tied to the back of a horse and killed by dragging his body through the city. Sorry, yes, yeah, sorry, thank you. I have a correction here. Bar-Hebraeus was Syriac, a Syriac Christian. Thank you. And afterwards, you had this attempt to restabilize the empire following the death of Arğun, following the death of Sa'd ad-Dawla. You have an intermittent period with Gaykhatu and Baidu for about 4 years before Ghazan restabilizes the empire and converts to Islam, which really unites the Persian bureaucrats with the Mongol princes. And from that point on, the Ilkhanate is a Muslim realm. That said, the Jews don't completely fade from the fabric of Persian life. You have Rashid ad-Din Hamadani, who's celebrated still today, who was a Jew until he converted at age 30 to Islam. And as a Muslim, he became the Grand Vizier of Ghazan's Ilkhanate court. So he was no longer Jewish, yes, but he was from a Jewish ancestry, and he was similarly to Sa'd ad-Dawla and a person who came from a medical background. So that's where I'm going to leave it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There is a lot of information there and a lot of background, and I think it's really just wonderful. I'm going to now encourage you to please open your cameras, open your microphones. Again, you're not being the presenter. I do want to mention that in addition to everything else Richard does, he did participate in our upcoming podcast series. Please do watch for them. It's called Reclaiming Identity, and we are going to be debuting them next week. So please do. Also, a little advertisement or something, promo, please do help support our programming by donating, going to our website at instituteofjewishexperience.org. And we look forward. So if you have a question, please do raise your hand. Again, please do open your cameras, and you can't see them unless you stop sharing your screen, please.
I have a question in
Right,
the
but can you stop sharing your screen so we can see people?
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay.
There we go.
It's just nicer. Thank you. Okay, now there's a question. Oh, Rick has a question. Yes.
Yeah. So, well, first I'm going to say, yes, this is going to be recorded and it's going to be uploaded to the ASF page. So it should be on YouTube. Hopefully everybody who attended today will get an email when that's uploaded. And that way they can see it. Now I have a question here and I'll read out the question from, Rick, if you want to say it, you can say it. If you want me to read it, I'll say it.
Rick doesn't have it open yet. 1 minute. Here. Now we can open. Okay. You can read it if he doesn't.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So when Joseph Hanagid, also a Jew, was promoted to the viziership of Granada in 1066, there was also a massacre of Jews in what Bernard Lewis called a reaction among the Muslim population against a powerful and ostentatious Jewish vizier. Would you draw the same conclusion about Sa'd ad-Dawla, who became Grand Vizier in 1289, but was killed, and at the same time there was an uprising against the Jews in 1291? I think this is a really great question. I think this sees a really strong parallel between these two communities. And in much the same way, we do have a situation where we have a Jewish vizier in power, and following the loss of that Jewish vizier of power, we have a riot against the Jewish community, right? There's some sort of tie of anti-Semitism to their bad rulership or undesired rulership, right? Sa'd ad-Dawla's rulership was good, just not for the leaders of the Persian bureaucracy and for the Mongol princes. It was arguably better for the people for the general people whose laws he reformed. Now, I would make a small distinction in the case of Samuel Hanagid and the case of Sa'd ad-Dawla, in that the violence against the Jewish community started not when Samuel Hanagid lost power, but when his son, who had inherited power from him, lost power. And the son was far less of an effective ruler than Samuel Hanagid had been. And so you saw a lot more animosity developing in the Granadan population because of animosity towards the son rather than animosity towards Samuel Hanagid. Samuel Hanagid in particular was also a military leader. He led Jewish troops into battle. And sorry, not Jewish troops. He led Muslim troops into battle. And so there was a large Muslim support for him as a leader, whereas most of the support that Sa'd ad-Dawla had came from people like Ordoqiyya, these Mongol princes who were sort of coming from Eastern Asia and didn't have the local power bases to draw power from. And so they had this sort of alliance of we're not them, which also drew in the Christians, right, from the Nestorian Christians. I have a question in the Q&A section by Michael. Michael, do you want to ask, or would you prefer that I read the question?
Okay, you can read it.
Okay. So the question is, what were the most pivotal periods of success the Jews experienced during the Mongol rule? And afterwards, was there a kind of Renaissance period? When we talk about Mongol rule, right, we've got all four of those different khanates, and they have different legal systems. Under most of the three other khanates, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty in China, we have Jews not being recognized for the majority of time as a acceptable religion. That said, the Mongols didn't persecute religious minorities, but the accepted minorities were allowed to petition the court, have their places of worship tax-free, and so they had a number of advantages versus the non-recognized religions. Now, Judaism was recognized in Arğun's court, specifically because of Sa'd ad-Dawla. Now, after Ghazan came to power in 1295, all the religions except Islam stopped being recognized religions. This doesn't mean that they were persecuted. It means that they didn't have the privileges of recognition, which would allow them court time, which would allow them to build new centers of worship, that would allow them to proselytize, a number of these other benefits. So to the extent that there was a Jewish Renaissance under the Mongols, and I don't think I would characterize it that way, it was more of a Jewish accession to power, right? Because when we say Renaissance, we mean some kind of cultural flowering and development. But that power existed for those 2 years, 1289 to 1291, that ad-Dawla was Grand Vizier of Arğun's Ilkhanate. To the extent that we have a Jewish Renaissance in the Persian empires, that tends to come a little bit later. That tends to come, I think, during the early Safavid period.
There's just a technical question. I'm going to put it into the chat. This recording, as well as many of the other recordings of some of our other programs, is on YouTube, instituteofjewishexperience.org. Institute of Jewish Experience. You can also find a link from our website. So please do check that out as well, especially for upcoming programs.
Sure. I have another question. Did the Jews hide their faith during any of the timeline you've covered today? If they did, how and when did they go about doing that? By and large, Jews in the Ilkhanate did not hide their identity. Up to Ghazan in 1295, right? You have to remember that the Ilkhanate did not have a declared religion. As I said, the Mongol policy was to recognize certain religions and not recognize other religions. So the dominant four religions that the Mongols recognized throughout the territories were Taoism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. Those were the four dominant recognized religions. As I said, Judaism cropped in sometimes, especially in the Ilkhanate because of ad-Dawla, but not being a recognized religion never meant direct persecution by the Mongols. That said, we have issues with the enforcement of Jewish law, especially in the Yuan dynasty. That's the Chinese side of the Mongol Empire, because Kublai Khan made an edict preventing kosher slaughter. According to the Yasa, or the Mongolic oral legal codex, the blood of an animal should not be exposed to the great sky. And so the idea of cutting the throat of an animal such that it would bleed out was in violation of this law. And so Jewish slaughter and Islamic slaughter were both targeted as illegal under the Yuan dynasty. We see similar laws flit in and out of existence during the reign of Ghazan and Uljaitu, his successor in the Ilkhanate, but they don't survive for very long, primarily because Muslims are now running the government. And so to the extent that they're proposed, they get quickly rejected. And the only reason that they're proposed is because of the Ilkhanate's relationship with the Yuan dynasty, the diplomatic relationship that they have. One of the interesting things that sort of cements this relationship, of course, is the journeys of Marco Polo, right? Marco leaves the Ilkhanate to go to the Yuan dynasty. He comes back from the Yuan dynasty to the Ilkhanate on his way back to Venice. I have a sort of comment question here from
I think
Michael.
actually that's a strong way to end it. So why don't we use that to help conclude the talk?
Sure. I find it interesting that these cultures were able to interact and trust one another when the Mongols ruled for such a long time. Trust is a strong word. It's much more, I would say, like the American situation between religions, in that there's this sort of competition for congregants, for airwaves, for religion in the Mongol sense was a business opportunity. They believed that you could never have too many people praying to too many gods for the welfare of the Mongol state. So if the Christians will pray to their god, and the Muslims will pray to their god, and the Taoists will pray to their gods, and the Buddhists will pray to their gods, hopefully one of them will intercede on behalf of the Mongols. That was sort of their thought pattern. And so they didn't see the point in repressing these other religions. I just have a quick question on the Ilkhanate's relationship with the Egyptian Mamluks. It was horrible. The Ilkhanate and the Egyptian Mamluks went to war on numerous occasions. I didn't cover it here, but they were bitter enemies, and there was almost no trade conducted between them.
And obviously, this is not the be all and end all of this time period. And like Richard said, please send me messages. Tell me that you want to hear more, and hopefully we'll continue the conversation. This is really just the tip of the iceberg here. So thank you so much, Richard, for joining us and for enlightening us. And I hope that we continue this. And thank you all for joining as well.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you. I'm really thankful that so many people were interested in hearing about this story and about the development of Jewish power in Iran.
It's great, an incredible time period. Thank you. Have a good day, evening, wherever you are in the world.
All right. See you.
Bye.
Bye.